Hello, welcome to Criminal Motives. My name is Matthew Pfeiffer. I'm a therapist, coach, author, and on this channel, I give my thoughts and reactions to different events that are happening in true crime and also in the news. If you enjoy that type of content, be sure to subscribe, like, share, and hit the bell notification so you're notified each and every time I upload a new video. In this video, I'm going to give my thoughts and reactions to the unfortunate event that happened in Vegas with a young lady named young girl named Addie, who was the victim of a murder suicide from at the hands of her mother, at the hands of her cheer mom mother. In a previous video, and I'll link my previous video above my head, in a card above my head, I talked about how this potentially could be over a custody issue. And even though we don't know that for fact, we do have some context clues as to that might be the reason that this possibly could have happened. So I'm going to get into today's video. But before I get into today's video, I just want to say that I know that a lot of the content in this subject can be very heavy and very intense for people. You might be someone who's actually going through a custody issue, maybe a heavy, difficult divorce, a toxic relationship that might involve kids, and it can be very difficult. And I've worked with that type of group for a long period of time, for well over a decade. And if you are someone who needs needs help or needs support, if you go to the links into the description box down below, you can meet with a therapist through BetterHelp. When you use the links in my description, you'll get 15% off your first month of therapy. With all that being said, thank you very much. And let's go ahead and get into today's video.
You hear the tragic news of the young life lost from the Utah Extreme program.
11-year-old Addie Smith died in a Las Vegas hotel room last week, and it was reportedly at the hands of her own mother, Tanya McGeehan. They lived in the Salt Lake City area, but were in Vegas for a big cheerleading competition. But a shadow fell over the final days of the All-Star Nationals as word spread that a member of a Utah cheer group had been killed.
And to the entire Utah Extreme and Cheer Fusion program, on behalf of all of us here at JAMS, we're going to send Utah Extreme Addie's medal and a national championship jacket. We dedicate our final day of All-Star Nationals to Addie.
Tragedy struck on Sunday, February 15th, when there was concern that Addie and her mom might be missing. They hadn't shown up to the events that were being put on by JAMS Cheer and Dance. Addie and McGeehan, they were staying at the nearby Rio Hotel and Casino. To do a welfare check.
The details of the call are: at approximately 10:45 this morning, LVMPD dispatch received a call for service for a check the welfare of a mother and her daughter. Officers arrived, met up with security, went up to the room and attempted to contact the mother and daughter in their room. They knocked several times and they called into the room without any answer. At that point in time, without anything else and no other information and nothing else suspicious, those officers advised security and they cleared from the call. Security continued to get information from family and friends asking them to attempt to locate the mother and daughter inside the casino. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, security went back up to the room to attempt to locate the mother and child again. They knocked several times. They also called into the room without success. At that point in time, security decided to make entry into the room, where when they entered the room, they located two deceased females. They immediately backed up and called 911. Patrol arrived and secured the scene. Homicide detectives have been notified and we're currently on scene investigating the crime. It appears the preliminary details that we know so far are: it appears that the mother and daughter came here for a dance competition or a cheer competition. Sometime last night, the mother shot her daughter and then shot herself.
Now, Lieutenant Price confirmed that some sort of note was found in the hotel room, although he didn't specify its contents. He also said during the news conference that no one so far had reported hearing gunshots. And as condolences pour—
One quick thing about this, and this is more on the suicide end of this, and I want to give a quick trigger warning in terms of suicide. And again, if you need resources, I have some resources for people in the description box down below. But oftentimes, with someone is suicidal and they're having those type of thoughts, people don't realize that whenever there is a big event like this situation, like not only a trip but a vacation with her daughter, that actually can trigger the suicidal thoughts or the actual attempt at suicide. A lot of times, and I don't know what type of, if any, diagnosis, but I'll get into that here in a little bit, that the mother may have had. However, a lot of times when someone is dealing with deep depression or other scenarios that might cause suicidal thoughts, whenever they have the energy to actually go out and do something like this, like a trip or some major event, oftentimes the thought and the trigger of them wanting or having the desire to escalate to an actual attempt or actually doing the deed might come at a point in time where they are quote unquote high on life, right? And the reason why this happens is that now all these thoughts that you've had through the months, years, weeks, now you have the energy to actually execute on that plan. And so this may have been something that she had thought about, that she had. Obviously there was a letter written, right? We don't know, just like they said, we don't know the context of that letter. But it very well could have been something that had been thought up and thought of for a long period of time. But let's get back into it.
Poured in from cheer groups from all over the country, new details started coming to light about the background, about McGeehan's fight to keep custody of her daughter, which had apparently been ongoing since Addie was just 2 years old. Now, to be clear, as we go through this, we don't know exactly what led to this, what would cause a mother to kill her own daughter, but just something to keep in mind as we give the context to this. So, according to Utah court records, McGeehan and her husband, Brad Smith, got divorced in 2015 and shared custody of Addie. But the relationship was reportedly tumultuous. The court had to step in to even kind of keep the peace here. In fact, things were so bad that a judge had to lay out exactly how custody swaps would even work. There are hundreds and hundreds of docket entries related to McGeehan and Smith's divorce, and most of the filings are under seal. But we got our hands on the latest decree from a Utah judge, which has details on the ex's custody arrangement, and it is very clear from those filings that the relationship between the two was acrimonious, to say the least. The documents indicate that Smith was awarded sole custody of Addie in 2020, and a judge found in October of that year that, quote, petitioner, so meaning McGeehan, is subjecting the child to behavior that is on the spectrum of parental alienation. It also states that, quote, petitioner has committed domestic abuse in the presence of the minor child. As part of that ruling, McGeehan had to be supervised by court-designated family members when she even spent time with Addie. Later on, a judge found McGeehan's behavior had improved. The custody agreement was modified to be 50-50, so 1 week on, 1 week off. According to the filing, quote, exchanges are to take place at AS's school when in session, that during times in which school is not in session, exchange will take place at the Harriman Police Department. So obviously at places where nothing bad could go down. The court documents even lay out exactly how the custody exchanges are supposed to happen. Quote, the parties are to park 5 parking stalls away from one another, and AS will walk herself to the receiving parent's car. Neither party is to videotape the child's exchanges. It almost feels like a hot.
So obviously, not only was custody an issue here, but obviously the exchanges were an issue here. So the two of them had ongoing issues, and I feel horrible for Addie, not only for the obvious with her life being taken, but also needing to deal with this, right? Of the two parents not even being able to set aside their differences in the best interest of their child. Now, one thing that I want to mention is that just because the mother had sole custody doesn't mean that she was the more mature mother, right, or more mature parent in the situation. There's a lot that goes into custody, work arrangements. Obviously the state sometimes comes in depending on who is more available in the beginning, and oftentimes the person who gets custody in the beginning, courts typically don't like changing that over, even if they see some bad behavior from the other parent. Let me zoom in real quick while I'm talking. They don't, even if they see some poor behavior from the parent, the court system typically doesn't like to turn over custody unless there are some even more egregious things. That can be very frustrating for people that are going through it. And again, I don't have the details of their custody arrangements, but we do know that there was a lot of issues and there was a lot of problems, even up to exchange. Now, the parental alienation, if you're not familiar with that term, it's a very controversial term. Some people don't even believe that it's a thing, and I'll have to do another video on this. But parental alienation is basically when you are alienating the child from the other parent, when that can come in a multitude of behaviors. That could be that you are making it difficult for exchanges. That can be you could not participate in exchanges. That could be that you're brainwashing the child. You could be talking poorly about the parent, and long story short, making it difficult for that child to have a relationship with the other parent. So we do know from the court documents that the mother was participating in that type of behavior, which really aligns with this murder-suicide, where even to death, she didn't want the other parent to have access to the child. And so this type of behavior really speaks to some sort of personality disorder, whether it be, and now before I get into the details, I don't want to stigmatize anyone who has any type of mental illness or personality disorder. However, we do know that people who engage in this type of behavior typically do struggle with some sort of mental health or some a personality disorder, whether it be borderline personality disorder, whether it be narcissism, whether it be antisocial personality disorder. Typically people who engage in this type of behavior and then there's, when we talk about the cluster B spectrum, there's a full spectrum of behavior that this could potentially align with. But anyway, I'm digressing. This type of behavior aligns with someone who, especially when we're talking about at this level, there can be, oftentimes people who go through a divorce oftentimes will be, can be hurt, or they want a level of control because one person likes their kids having sugar and the other person doesn't, right? There's a reason why people go through a divorce. And so custody, not only custody, but the way that the children are raised, it's very common for that to become an issue. But oftentimes, even people who have differences of opinion on the way that children are raised typically find like a happy medium, right? Even if one person or both people don't necessarily like what's going on, typically they typically start to mature and they start to heal. But when we're talking about someone who is struggling with a mental illness or a personality disorder, especially if they are not diagnosed and they're not receiving any type of services or support, we can see this behavior not only becoming problematic, but also becoming even more of a problem as time goes on. Sometimes that is because one person starts to date, maybe both people start to date, so they try to exert more control, even until a point where that person becomes abusive, because typically abuse is hidden under a shroud of I care, right? I care so much about you, I'm going to keep you away from the other parent, even if they don't have any good reason for it. But let's get back into it.
Hostage swap. According to the judge's ruling, each parent was entitled to 2 weeks of uninterrupted time with Addie during the summer when she was out of school. There were also rules for how Addie would communicate with one parent if she was staying with the other. For example, quote, during the regular parent time, each party will make AS available for FaceTime with the other parent on Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. If either parent fails to initiate the call by 6:15 p.m., they shall forfeit the FaceTime call for that day. And you can tell that every little thing seemed to be a source of contention between McGeehan and Smith, and the court had to intervene on multiple occasions. All communication between Addie's parents had to be via an app specifically used in custody situations. This is according to court documents. At school events or other gatherings, the parents were forbidden from approaching one another, but at the same time, it was required that Addie be allowed to speak with whomever didn't have custody of her at that time. Both parents were also responsible for splitting the costs of any extracurricular activities like cheerleading and dance. We know that sports and hobbies like those can get expensive quite quickly, especially when it comes to things like traveling for competitions. But again, I say all that to say we do not know exactly what led to this. I will tell you, Smith's brother started a GoFundMe page to raise money for Addie's funeral expenses. On the page, he wrote, "My brother Brad is facing an unimaginable loss after his daughter Addie was tragically taken from our family. This heartbreaking event has left the family in deep shock and grief, struggling to come to terms with the sudden loss of Addie in such a way. In the midst of this tragedy, we are reaching out to the community to help Brad and his family navigate the difficult days ahead. The funds raised will be transferred to Brad and go directly toward covering funeral expenses and providing much needed support for Brad and his family. With so much to process emotionally and financially, every contribution will help ease the burden and allow the family to focus on healing. Your kindness and generosity can make a real difference as they work through this painful time." Utah Extreme Cheer announced on their Facebook page that all classes were canceled for the rest of the week. Her former cheer group, Fusion Cheer, held a vigil on Monday night to remember her. Emily Morgan, who owns Utah Fusion All-Stars, coached Addie during her first year of cheer. This is according to media outlet KUTV, and she told the outlet, quote, "She would learn her part. She took a lot of pride in what she was doing. As a coach, that's the dream. And because of that attitude, I always knew she was going to go far in this experience. In cheerleading, you need every single person on your team. And if they are not there, there is a void. I think that everybody feels that void, whether you're on her team right now or you've been on her team before." I want to bring on Ashton Pack, private investigator, talk about this. Ashton, this is an incredibly sad case. I do wonder, would a private investigator come into a case like this afterwards to try to, piece together aspects of this to understand what happened?
Well, it's something that could happen. I mean, ultimately, people come to guys like me after law enforcement has concluded their investigation. And sometimes, certain jurisdictions don't have the vast resources like what we have available here in Las Vegas. Yeah, sometimes there are incidents where a private investigator like myself might be able to come in and help put some things together. The problem with working on the civilian side now as a private eye is you don't have the power of the subpoena unless there's an active case going within a court where I'm working for an attorney. Law enforcement has all the tools and the resources, and it's just a matter of how much they're going to pour into a case such as this.
And this seems to be a case where it's clear what happened. What's not clear is the why. So I do wonder whether you're an investigator working with law enforement, or you're a private investigator. How do you find out the why of something like this?
Yeah, we are obsessed with the why in this country, and I get it, because what would bring a mother to do something so horrific to their daughter, to her daughter like this? And yeah, you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, homicide detective's job is to determine, what was the cause of death? Was it a homicide, which is the death by...
One thing about, let's go back to the why that they were just talking about. So let's assume for a second, because I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that this was a part of parental alienation. Now, and I also want to be clear that both parents could potentially participate in parental alienation, and it can go back and forth. But one of the things that people oftentimes disagree with when it comes to parental alienation and these type of behaviors when it comes to divorce and custody is that people struggle to believe and think that a mother or father, for that matter, would do something that could cause destruction to their child because they want to, quote, get the other parent back. And speaking from someone who has worked in this industry for well over a decade, I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that that is 100% accurate, that they 100% will destroy their children's self-esteem, their physical being, obviously in a situation like this. They like the child, even though it seems like on the surface that they're putting the child first, and they will come across and they will talk as though they are. I can tell you beyond without any doubt that they most definitely are not. They're putting themselves first, and they're using their child as a weapon to punish the other parent. And again, that punishment can come for a multitude of reasons, and well, excuses, I should say. It could be because the other parent is dating someone else. It could be because the other parent is newly married. They could have bought a house. They could have gotten a promotion. They could have just looked happy one day. When we're talking about people who struggle with a personality disorder, you could have went and picked up the child and said hello and had a smile on your face, and you seemed too happy. You could have seemed too sad. This is really, when we talk about this type of behavior of weaponizing children, it's really anything at the expense and the destruction of the other parent. And even to this extent, so to this extent, it's more on the rare side. But I haven't had a case where it has gotten to this point, but I've seen and I've talked to and I've worked with and I've consulted people who there was a lot of concerns that it could get to this point. So I would not be surprised if at some point in time the letter comes out, and the letter that the mother left behind comes out, and there was something that was related to or talked about custody. But let's get back into what the private investigator was saying.
At the hands of another human. Was there a murder or a manslaughter committed? Yes, this was a murder. And ultimately, who are the perpetrators? Well, we know who the perpetrator is. This is unfortunately an open and shut case. And I'm sure there are a few things that homicide detectives will want to kind of piece together. They'll do a toxicology screening. They'll do anything that was found in the room, an analyzation of evidence that was at the scene. But it's really looking to point to see, is there anyone else that was involved with this crime, the crime of murder? And I'm pretty certain, I'm fairly certain, I never want to assume, but I can presume here that this case is going to be closed fairly quickly. But as far as motive is concerned, yeah, we might not really truly ever know. I know there was a note left. I'm sure they can piece together, some investigator could piece together through talking to family, friends, cohorts, people who were associates, as to what was going on in this person's life that would lead them to do such a horrific, violent act to their child.
Well, that's the question. I mean, how much do they look at the timeline? When was the gun? Where was the gun obtained from? When was it brought? Was there, what were the circumstances? What did the surveillance footage reveal? What were the past conversations? What was her relationship like with her ex? I mean, how much do they do, analysis of what led up to this? Again, it's a shame if this is an open and shut case, whereas there are so many still lingering questions here.
Yeah, it just depends on what, it really just depends on what the bosses want the detectives to do. We live this is a large city. It's a major metropolitan American city. There's no shortage of homicides in this city. And once a case is closed, those homicide detectives are unfortunately tend to have to move on to the next case, because that case is now pressing and has to be solved. So it just depends. Maybe they'll have someone in some kind of an intelligence unit do some follow-up. Maybe they'll coordinate at the end of the day with some Utah law enforcement officers to see if they had any prior cases. They might put some kind of an after action report together on this, but usually homicide detectives will create just a documentation, like kind of an officer's report of what happened when there's no submittal going to the district attorney's office. There's no criminal case that's being prepared for prosecution here. The perpetrator is, taken her life at her own hands. So yeah, it just depends. It's just a big, we don't know at this point. And it just kind of depends on what do the bosses at the police department want, and do we have time and resources to dedicate to a case that's pretty much solved.
Is it strange this happened in a hotel room like this?
I just think it's strange in general. What parent, as parent, you know, I'm a father. I have a daughter. I have two sons. What we as a society, this is just so perplexing.
So, from a suicidal standpoint, it's not strange that it actually happened in a hotel. So, even though the murder suicide at the hands of a mother to a daughter is more on the rare side, not impossible, the hotel situation, oftentimes people who have suicidal thoughts are concerned. This is going to sound very odd and strange, but they're oftentimes concerned about the cleanup. It's the reason why a lot of suicides happen in a bathroom, in a bathtub. Because they're thinking about the cleanup, and they're in a very strange way. They're thinking about other people, and they're thinking about what the mess that they're going to leave behind, and those sorts of things. And it's very common for this type of event to happen in a hotel, in a park, away from home. And this also kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, where they want one last moment, right? So on a trip, on a vacation, obviously they're on vacation, they want one last good moment before they take their final breath, so to speak. In terms of the suicide perspective, that part is not surprising. But the other part, like the private investigator said, it's to people who have not worked in an industry dealing with parental alienation. I think that it might be surprising. I think that people who, therapists and attorneys, people like that who have seen this type of behavior, I think they might be shocked but not surprised. When I heard about it, when I started hearing more that this more aligned with parental alienation, I was shocked, but I was not surprised, because like I mentioned before, I've seen cases that haven't gotten to this point, but there's been some scary moments.
Flexing to us. How could this happen? Especially a mom. Usually infanticide is at the hands of a father.
So I want to get back that he just literally just said something that that's kind of I think that potentially could have exasperated this. If you heard what he said, and you can rewind it back, he said, quote unquote, especially a mom. And this bias that people have when it comes to custody has not only could have potentially led to this event, but oftentimes leads to a lot of problematic behavior when it comes to custody, when it comes to visitation, all these things. It's very common for people to believe that mothers can't be or won't cause injury or harm to their children. And I can tell you that couldn't be any further from the truth. It's very common for people to believe that mothers can't and won't participate in parental alienation and withhold from the fathers. Now, I want to be clear. Obviously, men can do this. It's well documented that men can and do this, can and do this. But women also very much participate in this type of behavior. It's also very common for people to not believe that women don't commit suicide. They do, maybe not at the rate of men. Now, this is my own personal theory. One of my personal theories is the reason why the rates of suicide with men is so high is actually because of parental alienation, of children being withheld. And if you look at, and if you hear, and if you oftentimes talk to men who have experienced high conflict divorce, high conflict breakups, and they have experienced this, it's very common for them to have those type of thoughts, or even have an attempt. And when you look at the divorce rates and the how most custody oftentimes goes to women, it's starting to change a little bit now, but how custody oftentimes goes to women, the numbers actually kind of work out to seem as though that might be a factor into some of the reasons why men have a higher rate of suicide than women. But let's get back into this.
And when it's a mother, it's even more compounding to us as to how this could happen. So strange that it happened at all. In a hotel room in Las Vegas, of course it's strange. It's not the usual. It's not the norm. It's just how could a mom do this to her daughter?
So if you were hired to look into this case, where would you start? I do believe sometimes private investigators can get information that law enforcement can, but where would you start? What would you be looking for? How would you approach a case like this to try to understand more about it?
Well, if I was hired and it was, for the determination of, hey, why did mom likely do this? Again, I'm going to provide an assessment, and that assessment is going to be based off of interviews with people. Who knew mom best? Who knew the family? Are they willing to talk to me? Are these folks willing to engage with a private investigator and give statements? At the end of the day, there was a whole cheer competition. Is anyone within that organization willing to talk? We want to understand, the motives behind this. So for me, it would be interviewing people, talking to people, trying to build rapport with those folks. And it's just time intensive. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort, especially if it's just myself. Now, if I have a team of investigators, assembled, time and money is the only limit. How much money are you willing to spend to find out the why? And ultimately, it just takes time to assess everything, put it together in a concise report, and come up with some kind of this is what we assess with a modicum of confidence.
By the way, before we wrap things up, just one other interesting aspect is the ability of police to enter that hotel room, and there were questions surrounding that. Can you explain it?
Sure. Yeah. Law enforcement came out the first time under the call was a welfare check, which is 50 times a day all over. I mean, it's one of the most common calls law enforcement will get. I got them all the time when I was a law enforcement officer. But ultimately, law enforcement has to weigh the intrusion into someone's Fourth Amendment rights to be safe in their place of where they're at. And your Fourth Amendment rights don't end when you go into a Las Vegas hotel room. So, law enforcement came out, hey, there's a welfare check. These people missed the cheer competition. We're concerned.
All right. So before we get off, I wanted to get back into they were talking about the investigation. If I were a private investigator and I were investigating the motives behind this, I would interview the friends of the parents of Addie's friends. That's one place I would start out with. People who potentially, anyone, coaches, the cheer coaches, anyone who potentially could witness Addie's demeanor when they're with each parent. That's one place, that's one source. It can be kind of tricky interviewing therapists but because of HIPAA laws and things like that. But I would definitely interview people who were more neutral and people who might be on both sides. And I would look at some of the things I would look at is who, quote unquote, who needed to have all of the control, right? So the school, I would talk to the secretary, like, what was it like when dad would pick up versus like, what was it like when mom would pick up? Did dad ever arrive expecting to pick up Addie and mom had picked her up early to withhold? I would review some of those court documents in terms of who was oftentimes withholding the child from the other parent, who exerted more control, and whenever there was a perception of a loss of control, what would happen. I would definitely review the text messages between the two. I also would look at the events leading up to this. So oftentimes when we're talking about parental alienation, assuming that that's what the motive here, I would look at, did dad go on a trip with Addie? Was there, I know that they had a custody court date coming up, or they were in the middle of a custody battle. I would look at, was there an expectation that custody was going to flip over to dad? I would review things like that, because if there was an expectation or a potential or if there was potential that custody was about to flip, then that could be reason and that could be motivation. And like I said before, people don't think that mothers are capable of harming their children. And I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt, not, maybe not as often to this extent, but it definitely can happen. But thank you guys very much for watching. If I understand that, once again, that this video and my content can be very heavy. If you need resources, if you need someone to talk to, connect with a therapist, a licensed therapist through BetterHelp, you go to the links in the description box down below. You'll get 15% off your first month of therapy. Be sure to, if you want to stay up to date on this case and other cases that may not make it to the news or may not have time to make a video about, be sure to subscribe to my Substack linked in the description box down below. With all that being said, also, if you enjoy this video, there should be some other videos should be another video on the screen. If you want to check out some of my other content, be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the bell notification so you're notified every time I upload a new video. With all that being said, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video. You guys have a good one.